Hello, welcome back to Wolf's Corner. I am your host, and today we are returning to Vraks. Last we left off, the Dark Angels chapter had entered the battle and left about as quickly as they came. Of course that was okay, as they had smashed the only working spaceport on Vraks that was not in the Imperial's control. Now, we're going to rejoin the 88th Siege Army and its commander, good old Lord Commander Ezekiel, whose name I have been butchering up to this point, as he planned to try and get his timetable back on schedule, because he knew he was running out of time. After all, this planet was supposed to be taken in a nice and even 12 years, with the last couple of years spent simply letting the heavy guns pound the defenders' last strongholds into dust. But here we are at year number 9, and the Krieg army was still stuck on the second defensive line. So as you can imagine, Ezekiel had probably worn out parts of his command center's floor from his pacing, while trying to come up with a plan that will not only get his men closer to their final objective, but also save his own skin. With the destruction of the spaceport and the arrival of a fresh line corps from Krieg, Ezekiel thought he had everything he needed to succeed. And how do you think he was going to use these forces? In carefully coordinated, small-scale infiltration actions that probe for the weakest point in the enemy's defenses that pushed through them with well-trained and focused groups of troops? Don't be ridiculous! Of course, Ezekiel ordered his commanders to prepare for an all-out offensive across the entire front line. Every single regiment under his command would be thrown into this attack in the assumption that such a push would force the enemy to commit his reserves to stem the flow of this gray tide and ceaseless shelling. Maybe the attack would crack open the second defensive line and rush all the way down to the final defense line and get through it before the traitors had a chance to dig in and defend those positions. You know, you'd think that after 9 years of doing the same thing again and again, Ezekiel would have decided to try a new strategy that, might actually get the results he is so desperate to achieve. But no. Instead, this spoiled noble just says, do the same thing again. This time it's bound to work. While this plan was being created, no doubt to the eternal frustration of the Administratum, whose nice and neat charts had to be completely changed every time one of these attacks failed to succeed in breaching the line, the preparations were too large and frankly noisy for the traitors to not realize that something was going to happen. Their patrols and their OPs reported the troop increases and the new stockpiles of arms and equipment. So their artillery decided to try and spoil this, but each time their guns fired, the Krieg artillery responded with the old, "Not happening!" counter battery fire. It would not do for the defenders to give away all their artillery positions before the assault began, because every gun destroyed now meant there was one less to fire shells at the Imperial troops when they climbed out of their trenches. Finally, on 089, year 822 M41, the Krieg artillery began their preparatory bombardment. All day and night these guns blasted away, trying to destroy the defenders before the Krieg assault ever began. Those defenders not blown apart, buried, or otherwise killed by the bombardment waited it out, knowing what was coming next. In the communication trenches of the Krieg lines, troops moved up during the night, carrying all the gear they had been given for this assault. Like before, the second wave also got into position, just as equipped as the first. As the light of the day began to appear, the bombardment stopped, and silence crept across the fields of Vraks. Then the order came through the Voxcasters, and then to the men. Once again, the Krieg infantry surged out of their trenches, and once again they charged headlong into a lethal killing field of enemy fire. The Vraks traitors had rushed to man their weapons the second the bombardment had stopped, and after 9 years fighting, they did not have to wait to see the Kriegsmen before they started firing. As before, the Kriegsmen kept advancing out of the trenches as the traitors' artillery joined the deadly fire in no man's land. This killing field was so effective that an entire regiment, the 158th, collapsed and their attack turned into a total shambles. Commissars among the assault squads tried to stop the retreat, executing the first men who turned to retreat back into the trenches, demanding this regiment stand and keep pushing. This got these officers of the Imperium a last shot to the face as the shredded formations got back into their own trenches. Here, as with those first attacks all those years ago, the first wave collided with the second wave trying to get ready for their attack. In just a couple hours, with the officers trying to force their way up over the parapet, the 158th Regiment fell completely apart, leaving their attack zone untouched. And before you think that the regiment was able to get away with killing commissars and running away, don't forget that this is the 41st millennium. For the failure to maintain control of their men and continuing the attack, the entire command staff of the 158th Regiment were arrested and executed. The army commissars officially disbanded the remnants of the 158th, sending the survivors to the dreaded penal legions. While the 158th's attack was an abject failure, other regiments had far more success in their efforts. But for the most part, it was simply the fact that the attack did not completely fall apart that makes their efforts more successful. However, in one case, the 291st Regiment's attack actually did fairly well. They had complete domination in the artillery battle, and their infantry kept pushing even during the night. The siege army realized this success and planned to take advantage of it. So the 11th Assault Corps, held in reserve for just such an occasion, loaded into Gorgon transports and started to move to their assault positions. It would need an entire day to get this attack ready, so the 291st would have to wait and hold onto their gains until then. The second day saw the Krieg regiments try to consolidate their positions or keep attacking to capture objectives they had been given on day 1. Unfortunately, the attacks on day 1 and 2 cost some regiments so heavily that several colonels sent word back to the army command, warning them that at this rate, their regiments would be completely wiped out. But army command, especially Lord Zekiel, would not even consider calling off this assault. After all, his arse was on the line right now. Of course, while the 88th was hurting, the traitors were hurting just as badly, if not worse. On day 3, the 11th Assault Corps were committed to the attack. Their tanks and Gorgons smashed into the thinly held front line, and by mid-morning they were approaching, cracking the second defensive line wide open. Unfortunately for the Krieg commanders, they were not fighting mindless automaton. The Vraks traitors knew that the Krieg units would use the success of the 291st as the staging point for an attempted breakthrough. So they used the day in between the success of the regiment and the actual assault to prepare a counterattack. When the 11th began to advance across more open ground, traitor armor, including 12 destroyer tank hunters, moved out to meet them. This counterattack not only stopped the 11th, but they had actually been pushed back. The hoped-for breakthrough did not pan out. Ironically, while this attack petered out, other areas of the offensive were having more success. It's kind of ironic that the area that had more success and the breakthrough that was planned to go through fails, and yet another area just happens to be better. But again, I use that term loosely because more success in this situation means that they haven't been completely pushed back into their own trenches and they're actually getting somewhere, but they're really not punching through. For 7 days, the 88th Siege Army smashed itself against the defensive line. The assaults had consumed the army's reserves, both men and ammunition, reducing companies to platoons and platoons to sections. The only reserves left were made from the shredded remnants of units too badly mauled by their own assaults. It seemed that the assault would fail until the arrival of a new regiment into the battle line. The 468th, a brand new unit fresh from Krieg, prepared to attack one sector of the traitors' defenses. But instead of simply charging straight at the waiting guns like before, their Colonel Atas decided to try a different strategy. Galvanizing his sub-commanders to make a concentrated attack instead of the clumsy and uncoordinated assaults, Atas planned to launch an attack at night. At first his plan was opposed by higher command because they thought the coordination needed to move so many soldiers at night into no man's land was not worth the risk. Atas argued, however, that if his regiment could get all the local artillery to support the attack, then his men would be protected from enemy artillery or defensive fire. Plus, Atas pointed out that even if the assault was a failure, his regiment could withdraw without the heavy cost that other units had suffered. This argument convinced his superiors, and Atas was given the call to proceed. On a dark night, Atas led his assault companies out of their trenches, crawling through no man's land like snakes through grass. When they approached the halfway point, the entire supporting artillery opened up the same way artillery did in countless barrages during this siege. But at the designated time, that fire concentrated on the front line right where Atas was waiting. Following their set timetable, the artillery lifted and moved forward to their next targets. Right at the same time, the assault companies stood up and started running. Not expecting the assault to come so quick, the defenders did not have the time to react to the assault companies before they were shooting them down in their trenches. Colonel Atas leapt over one trench and urged his men to keep moving when he faced a serious danger. Remember those Ogren berserkers the traitors had been creating back at the start of this whole debacle? Well, one of those lovely fellows came out of the trench and struck the colonel with its massive sledgehammer, killing him instantly. Despite the loss of their CO, the 468th continued their attack, finally breaching the second defensive line after 9 years of war. When word of the success got back to High Command, they immediately rushed to exploit this before the traitors had a chance to seal the breach again. The first reinforcements was a battery of quad launchers pulled there by Centaur transports. They were quickly set up and started firing at the enemy's desperate counterattack, trying to dislodge the 468th from their positions in the second defensive line. After that came tanks, Gorgons, bigger guns, and last but certainly not least, Death Riders, who immediately started riding through the breach and heading east and west to attack the traitors from behind. Now I know what you might be thinking. This sounds very familiar. Well, that's because it is! Just like the breakthrough in the first defensive line that happened 8 entire years before. Yes, seriously, the Krieg Guardsmen have been stuck trying to crack this defensive line for 8 years. The second defensive line immediately began to crumple up and fold away like a house of cards. With only suicidal rearguard actions to slow down the unrelenting tide of grey greatcoats, the traitorous Vraks militia fled back towards the final defensive line and the citadel. And they had good reason to hightail it. All across the front line, the siege regiments advanced without pity or mercy. Any enemy they caught in this progress were overwhelmed and completely destroyed, while in some places the Kriegsmen advanced completely unopposed. While this was an incredible victory, which Lord Ezekiel was no doubt kissing a statue of the Emperor's feet in thanks, the 88th Siege Army was too badly mauled from the attacks they made before to fully capitalize on this success and push all the way into the third defensive line before the traitors had a chance to fortify it. We've been talking about all these battles that have resulted in entire regiments being slaughtered in a matter of minutes. In the 9 years that the Siege of Vraks has been going on, over 4 million guardsmen have died trying to reach this point. And they're not even done. However, despite the cost and the delays, now we might actually be near the end of the siege. After all, the Imperials had pushed the traitors back to the smallest defensive line, so now they could concentrate their artillery and men in a far narrower front, and, more importantly, that citadel which the traitor Cardinal who started this whole mess had been holed up in this entire time was finally in range of the Guard's Earthshaker cannons. So in effect, the Kriegsmen did not have to advance any further. All they had to do was create an impenetrable ring around the traitors' defenses and keep their artillery supplied until they reduced the defenses into so much rubble. Now you might think, if the traitors knew all this, they must be panicking. Well, they were. At least most of them. Cardinal Zephan was not panicking. To him, this fight was the apocalypse he foretold. So naturally, the slaughter had to continue. It did not matter if they won or lost, only that they caused more destruction. Of course, by this point Zephan had gone completely cuckoo, and it didn't help that Arcos the Faithless, that Alpha Legion troublemaker the Dark Angels had tried to get their hands on, was now Zephan's most valued advisor. And it was he who reassured the Cardinal that the war was not over. The gods of chaos would grant him favor as long as he did not give up and surrender to the Imperials. And more forces would come to help them. Remember when I mentioned that Arcos' sorcerers had basically put out that psychic help wanted note back before? Well, now they decided to add to that message by performing a ritual sacrifice that would act as a beacon for the forces that would soon descend on Vraks like a swarm of locusts to a crop field. Now we're going to leave the surface of Vraks for a moment and jump to the space around the system. You see, this entire time the siege has been going on, there had been continuous supply runs from the supply depots, or even all the way from the Forge World Lucius, where many of the supplies for the 80th Siege Army were produced, to the army on Vraks. These supply convoys needed protection from pirates, aliens, and traitor warbands to get their supplies to the army. So, ever since the start of the siege, a force of Imperial Navy vessels had been stationed in the system to protect the convoys. Now, what do you think this force might be made of? A few battle cruisers? A squadron of cruisers? Nope! This force to guard the convoys supplying the entire army on Vraks consisted exactly of one Lunar-class cruiser, a squadron of system defense monitors, and an escort squadron of sword frigates which by this point had been reduced to precisely 3 vessels. Think about this. You have 4 void-capable ships and 3 local defense vessels to protect Vraks. And all these ships had been at this task for 10 years without rest. So yeah, the defenses around the Vraks system were fairly pathetic. Let's just call them what they are. While this force was capable of seeing off any pirates, raiders, or regular trader warbands who might try to attack the supply convoys to Vraks, there was a much more dangerous threat on the horizon. As I mentioned, the sorcerers on the planet had just sent out a second call for support from old friends. Well, this signal was heard not only by these individuals. The gathering force of chaos around the Eye of Terror was picked up by Imperial observation posts hidden away to keep tabs on the Eye. Astropathic messages reached Battlefleet Scaris' high command about these concerning events. Planning out the likeliest routes, the commanders dispatched groups of ships to the systems which they thought would be the target of the Chaos raid, and ordered several cruiser squadrons to ready stance to react the moment they found the Chaos fleet. Even a force of Astartes were contacted for a fast response against this force. While the fleet commanders were getting ready, another Imperial organization was watching this development carefully. The Ordo Malleus had sent a special ship with a single pariah into the Eye to transmit as much information as possible before it disappeared completely. The information this one little ship revealed terrified the Inquisitors who saw it. 30 traitor ships of the line had organized into a single armada to launch an attack against the Imperium. The Inquisition sent some of their information to the Battlefleet, who scrambled even more forces to meet this raid. More patrol groups were dispatched, and the largest capital ships, including the fleet's own flagship, the Emperor battleship Constantine Valdor, were ordered out of their home ports and ready to defend the sector against chaos. While all this was going on, Rear Admiral Raziak on board the lunar cruiser Lord Bellerophon, in command of the Vraks Defense Force, was busy getting his own force ready. Not only did he have 7 ships under his command, all of them were lacking in some detail. His Void ships needed refit from the decade of traveling through the Void protecting convoys, and the defense monitors had reduced magazines because they had to keep up regular firing drills to maintain their crew's skills. So naturally, the Rear Admiral was less than pleased about his force. But he was still an Imperial Navy commander, and thus he would do everything possible to try and protect the space around Vraks. Deploying his 3 escort vessels to the outer points of the system as picket, Raziak waited for the inevitable. Finally, one of his escorts made contact with 3 infidel raiders. The frigate did not engage the ships as per the Rear Admiral's orders, but he knew that now the traitors were aware of how weak his forces actually were as the raiders withdrew. 6 days later, the actual traitor force arrived. 14 energy signatures were detected as Raziak formed his battle line. His small and understrength force had been bolstered by 2 armed freighters, a heavy transport, and 3 transports converted into fire ships. When the Chaos fleet arrived, it broke into 2 groups. 5 ships led by Arcos' own flagship, the despoiler battleship Anarchy's Heart, moved towards the port side of the Imperial fleet, while 9 ships led by the Styx heavy cruiser Blood Dawn moved to the starboard side. When the battle finally began, it was a bloody opening. 1 sword frigate was crippled by the Anarchy's Heart's batteries, 2 of the defense monitors were destroyed, and the heavy transport Isra Moors was damaged to the point that it was operating on minimal power. But instead of abandoning ship, the captain of the transport ordered his crew to continue firing. The Lord Bellerophon herself had also been hit, wounded but still fighting. Her guns had destroyed 2 of the Chaos destroyers and damaged the heavy transport Aeron's Bane. But as the fight continued, 2 of the Chaos cruisers did not engage. At first it looked like the ships were disengaging, even as the Chaos fleet had the clear advantage. But that was before the new arrivals. Battlefleet Scaris had sent the command out to the nearest battle force to Vraks. Cruiser Group Mazur, named for its commander Titus Mazur, arrived to bolster the Imperial force. This force consisted of the Gothic cruiser Consul Thrakai, Dominator cruiser Orion, and the Grand cruiser Covenanter, and a squadron of escorts. Despite the arrival of these forces, the 2 largest ships of the Chaos Force, Anarchy's Heart and Aeron's Bane, proceeded towards Vraks. Both ships had a more important duty than simply destroying the Imperial presence in the system. While the 2 ships advanced, the Blood Dawn aimed its launch base to unleash Dreadclaw assault boats towards the Isra Moors, intending to take the giant ship as a prize. But at this point, Rear Admiral Raziak ordered his fire ships into the fight. One drove right into the stern of Aeron's Bane. Unfortunately for the Imperials, the Chaos transport was already in Vraks' gravity well, so it started to fall towards the surface. and the crew of the ship managed to control the vessel enough to make a gentle crash on the planet. Its passengers emerged from the wreckage, dazed and surprised, but still ready to unleash horror on the Imperial forces fighting elsewhere on the surface. Meanwhile, Anarchy's Heart was able to release hundreds of drop pods and landing craft onto Vraks. It was not Alpha Legionnaires inside them. Arcos' allies and contacts had traveled on his flagship to Vraks, and now they were heading for the war zone on the surface. Even though they knew they had failed to stop the Chaos forces, Rear Admiral Mazur was not about to give up so easily. He passed on instructions to the Covenanters' captain to pass on his opinion that Rear Admiral Raziak had failed in his duty as an Imperial officer to go to a board of inquiry at the battle fleet's headquarters. Mazur would not be doing so as he ordered his flagship to ramming speed against the Anarchy's Heart. Sadly, the Rear Admiral's attempt to destroy the battleship did not succeed, though it did make him the stuff of stories that future generations of Imperial Navy personnel would speak about. But in the end, the battle for the Vraks system was lost at this point. The Gothic cruiser, 4 sword frigates, 2 defense monitors, the Isra Moors, and the 3 fire ships had all been lost. Every other remaining Imperial vessel was heavily damaged. Only the Grand Cruiser Covenanter survived the fight, able to continue her duties. Meanwhile, the only confirmed kills against the Chaos Fleet was the Aeron's Bane and at least 4 Raider ships. The rest may have been damaged, but they were still able to unleash their cargo onto the surface of Vraks. Among these were Khornate berserkers like the Berserkers of Skalarthrax and the Skull Takers led by their warlord, Zufar the Blood Reaver. There was also an Iron Warriors warband called the Steel Brethren who were masters of siege warfare who would help the traders on Vraks in their efforts against the Imperials. Along with these were dozens of other warbands all serving different Chaos gods or Chaos Undivided ready to spill Imperial blood in the name of Chaos. The Siege of Vraks had just taken on a whole new dimension. And with that wonderful note, we will leave the siege. When we return, we'll be nearing the end of it, when desperation on both sides bring the biggest forces yet involved in the siege to battle, and forces who had been watching from the sidelines finally take action after realizing what was happening on Vraks. Thank you all for the patience with this delay on the video. As before, I will ask you all which series of videos you want to see next based on previous votes. The Badab War or the Wars for Armageddon? And always, for more good Warhammer lore and stories, check out the channel links in the description. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please help the channel grow. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. This is the Wolf's Corner. Have a good day.